where herbicide is a pesticide. So everything when I say pesticide, I am including herbicides. And for a pesticide to be legally used, it has to be both federally registered, in which case it's going to have a pest control products number assigned to it, and provincially classified. And I'm going to explain those a little bit more as we move along. The first part is the pesticide classification. In Ontario, there's two pesticide classes. Class 1, which is manufacturing concentrates, isn't really part of this webinar. And also Class 12, which are the neonicotinoid treated corn and soybean seeds, is not being discussed here at all. The main ones that we will be looking at and sort of keep in mind as we move forward, Class 2, 3, and 4, which are agricultural, commercial, and/or restricted classes. That's the designation federally. The products are manufactured, labeled, and sold for licensed and trained individuals. Class 6 and 7 are domestic products. And 9, 10, and 11 are active ingredients. Class 9 are the active ingredients that are banned for cosmetic uses, which, again, we're going to touch base on as we move forward. So the second part of that initial statement is when used appropriately and safely. So it has to be acknowledged that pesticides have both benefits, which is they're going to control the pest, but they also have risks. So if they're used improperly, there can be adverse effects. As part of the federal registration process, Canada or the PMRA will approve a PIC label, which all approved uses and measures that must be taken in order to mitigate any potential risks. And you must follow all pesticides, all directions on the current label for a pesticide. When I do say current for a reason, is that the federal definition of a label is the one that is on the registry in Ottawa. So that's the one that has to be followed. So it must be used according to the label. Your pesticide has a label. It does get updated from time to time. So periodically you may want to check and see if there's an updated version. The label provides the approved uses, conditions for use, includes the pests that can be controlled, application methods, the application rate, safety, and everything you need to know. You are expected to read and understand and follow all requirements of the current label. And what we say frequently is the label is the law. Where the label says you have to follow. So it becomes, well, where do you find the current labels? Canada has online a nice search page. The link to it is at the bottom of the slide. You can also find it quite easily just by Googling PMRA and label or label search. And it will take you right to this page where you can, so in the top part, you enter text you wish to search for. You could actually type in the name of a pest. It will come back, and so if you type in Phragmites, it will come back with every pesticide label that has Phragmites listed on the label. You also search if you have a particular pesticide. You can search by specific criteria, such as the pest control products number is usually the easiest and the most direct way to search, and that will give you the actual current label that you are required to follow. And then the next part of that statement is, and safely can be used. So who uses it? A pesticide, as discussed already, must be registered and classified and used according to the label. But using the pesticide also has some requirements. So Section 5.1 of the Pesticides Act basically requires that if you're using a pesticide, it must be appropriately licensed for a pesticide until you're exempt. The licensing is sort of means to ensure that training has been, the person who is licensed has passed a couple of exams. And there are the exemptions to the license requirements will apply for the owner or full-time employee to use a domestic product, so that's class 5, 6, 7, on property that they or their full-time employee owner or occupy. And just as a note, it doesn't really apply to this webinar per se, but it is important to note that that exception does not apply to a landlord regarding a rented apartment. So in that case, you would need a license, or the resident of the apartment could use it. There are also supervised assistants. So if a company or a person is licensed, they can supervise up to 3 unlicensed people. They either be technicians, so they hold a technician certificate, and they're indirectly supervised by the licensed exterminator. And there's a lot of conditions and requirements for that. If you need information, we can discuss that later. And then there's also trainees, which is an unlicensed person does not have the technician certificate. They have to be supervised hand in hand, so they're basically on the same site if anything were to go wrong. The license type, so, an example, no person shall sell, transfer, store, use a pesticide without the proper license. The licenses would be vendor's license to sell pesticides, an exterminator license for someone who's using a pesticide, and operator license if you are performing the extermination for fee or payment. And that would come into place any time that there's an exchange of money, in exchange for an extermination. The main ones that we would be looking at here today are going to be the land exterminator licenses. So there's agricultural, landscape, industrial vegetation, aerial, and forestry. They are pretty much as they sound as far as what they're used for. And the license is required, has a lot to do with the intent of the extermination. So if it's part of an agricultural operation, within the agricultural license. It's a roadside, and that's a public work, that would require the industrial vegetation license. And licensing is separate from the cosmetic ban, which we'll get to shortly, and these are the same license classes that have been in place for a few decades now. And I am going skim over a lot of sections of the legislation, mostly just to give a reminder to make sure that you are aware that whenever pesticide is used, there are always a lot of requirements. This isn't the full list, but I just want to give that reminder. So whenever a pesticide is used, unless you're exempt, so that would be a domestic product on your own residential property, you either post the notice sign if you're using a Class 11 active ingredient, or a warning, the red warning sign, if you're using a Class 9 active ingredient. So those were the ones that were for cosmetic uses. On the ministry website, you can either find all of the classes, hopefully easily. Whenever you have purchased a pesticide and you're going to be using it, and it's going to be in storage, there are stringent storage requirements, which vary according to class. So Class 2 commercial products are the more hazardous, persistent products, have the greater potential for adverse effects. And then Class 4 are still commercial products, but not as risky, I guess. So, but for all pesticides, they have to be, unlikely to contaminate food or impair health or safety, which is hopefully obvious. The storage area needs to be clean and orderly, and precautions to prevent contamination of the environment. And then based on the class, there are further storage, requirements. If it's a Class 2, it requires Class 2 or 3, it requires ventilation to the outside atmosphere, and so forth. So that is important just to be aware of. Something else I'm going to mention as well, just because a number of you will be interested in the Phragmites. Our extermination permits are required for high-risk products and also special uses. if for the application of a pesticide to water, in most cases it does require a permit. You would apply to the regional pesticide specialist, so an eastern region would be myself, for that the permit. So if it's for the aquatic herbicides for mosquito larvae, all the catch basins that are treated for the West Nile virus program, also for sea lamprey control, so Fisheries and Oceans Canada gets a few permits. Aerial applications, so for crown forests or the application of a Class 2 pesticide by aerial application requires a permit. There's some land permits required. That's really limited to just a couple scenarios. Usually that won't come up. And then, of course, and then there's also the structural ones. But for Phragmites control, even if there is not currently a pesticide registered for use in water to control Phragmites, when that does happen, and it sounds like it will, a permit will be required to use that product. And so the permit's going to impose any site-specific restrictions, conditions, such as timing to protect fish habitat, the rate, quantity, what public notifications required, buffer zones, etc. And all of that is determined on a case-by-case basis. So going back to our overview, which already gone through, the first pesticides when used appropriately and safely, and in accordance with the label and properly licensed person, can be used to control an invasive terrestrial plant provided it's on the label. So the next part is the more relevant part for this webinar. All of that can be used under exception to the cosmetic pesticides ban, provided all requirements have been met. So, as you may be aware, Ontario cosmetic pesticide ban has been in place since 2009. The ban prohibits the sale and use of products containing designated active ingredients, so that's Class 9 active ingredients, on land unless under an exception. So there are a number of exceptions to them, which would be essentially non-cosmetic uses. Some of them are listed here. There'd also be, say, arboriculture for trees, golf courses, which have a number of restrictions and conditions for integrated pest management, annual reports and stuff. But the ones that maybe more related here would be the uses related to agriculture, for forestry, promotion of public health or safety, and other prescribed uses if the prescribed conditions have been met, which is the way the legislation is written. So obviously the first one is agriculture. So the definition of an agricultural operation is found in the regulation. It's fairly short, as you'd expect. Does not include growing like a hobby farm or growing for your own use. And this exception applies to the use of a pesticide required as part of that agricultural operation. So you can't, spread a lawn of a farm, like on the front lawn of a farm, because that's not required in the agricultural operation. It requires either the agricultural class of land exterminator's license, or if farmers using the pesticides on their farm that they own or operate, the grow pesticide safety certificate for the Class 2 or 3s, and then the Class 4s, they would be exempt. The forestry exception, which is a significant one, especially say for dog strangling vine and a number of the forest invasive plants. So first, a forest is defined as an area of trees that's 1 hectare in size or greater. This exception applies to activities related to the harvest, renewal, maintenance, establishment of a forest, protected forest resources, and accessing a forest for either of the above things. It does require a forestry class of land exterminator license. That is important to note there, the difference. Another exception is plants poisonous to the touch. So health and safety exceptions to the cosmetic pesticide ban for the control of plants, poisons and such, such as poison ivy, poison sumac, giant hogweed, wild parsnip, which in the eastern region is a big one. Those plants are poisons to the touch, and so to control them, you use a Class 10 pesticide ingredient, so the ingredients listed in Class 10, which are glyphosate and related active ingredients. An exception for other legislation. So if a weed or a plant is listed under the Weed Control Act as a noxious weed to agriculture, if the local weed inspector determines that yet you need to control a specific plant or invasive plant under the Weed Control Act, then in order to comply with that legislation or order, then you would be exempt from the cosmetic pesticide ban. And if the use of a pesticide was the most appropriate and practical way to control the invasive pest or the weed, then you'd use a pesticide. And again, if it's a commercial pesticide, licensing still applies. You still need the sign. Everything else still applies, but you'll be accepted from the ban. And that brings us to the exception for natural resources, which Francine's going to talk about. And just as that if any of the other exceptions apply, you can't use the natural resources one. So I'll turn it back over to Francine.
Okay, Scott. Yeah, I'm just going to move you off presenter now, but and then I'll mute you and I'll unmute you for questions. Okay?
Great, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's Francine McDonald speaking. So I'll take up where Scott left off and talk about how you can apply for a letter of opinion for the natural resources exception. Review. I'm going to talk about some of the provisions, natural resource management projects, and outline decision criteria for if the project meets the intent of the natural resources exception and who can undertake a project under that exception. Indicated, the cosmetic pesticide ban took effect in April 2009 with objective to reduce public exposure to pesticides and it applies to cosmetic uses of pesticides. Recognition that there was a need to allow for the use of certain pesticides for certain kinds of activities. As Scott has indicated, there are a number of exceptions to the cosmetic pesticide ban, which include uses related to agriculture, forestry, promotion of public health or safety, and then other uses, and then finally the natural resources exception. So the exception is essentially intended for resource management projects that propose to use Class 9 pesticides, but must comply with the requirements of the natural resources exception. The purpose of these projects is to manage, protect, establish, or restore natural resources with the goal of protecting and enhancing Ontario's biodiversity. So for the natural resources exception is that the project must control an invasive species, or it must benefit a species of plant or animal native to Ontario, or protect or restore a rare ecosystem or its components. And the project must also be in accordance with integrated pest management principles. And this is important. Another exception under the Pesticide Act should apply. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of what that last statement means. So do apply to your project. That's one of the things your first considerations when you're looking at the natural resources exception. But if your project is covered by another provision under the Act, this exception does not apply. So for example, if you're controlling dog strangling vine in a woodlot that exceeded 1 hectare in size and was impacting your ability to harvest trees, that would actually be a forestry exception. So you wouldn't use this exception and you wouldn't require a letter of opinion for that kind of activity. An example would be if Phragmites is impacting visibility on the highway right-of-way, that would fall under the public health or safety, public works exception. And hogweed is a public health or safety issue, so it would fall under the poisonous plant exception. So it's important to consider whether or not other exceptions apply to your project before you consider requesting a letter of opinion for the natural resources exception. I think that any of these other exceptions apply, you should contact the MOECC Regional Pesticide Specialist for information about these exceptions. That would be folks like Scott Olin. So if you determine that it does apply, who can actually undertake a project under the exception? So the Act states that the project may be undertaken by M&R or Conservation Authority staff or licensed exterminators that have been hired by the Conservation Authority or by M&R. It can also apply to proponents who have an agreement with M&R, or it can apply to people who have received a written opinion from M&R, from a regional director, that indicates that, yes, as part of their view of your project, they agree that this project meets the criteria of the natural resources exception. And of course, also adhere to any other provisions of the Act. If you're a person who wants to apply for a letter of opinion from M&R for the natural resources exception, first thing they will consider is the objective of the project to control or eradicate an invasive plant. So how M&R deals with that is they confirm the identification of the plant species you're proposing to control is indeed an invasive plant, and often use supporting documents like from the Ontario Invasive Plant Council guide to confirm that control is not cosmetic. So this exception is not intended for the control of a species like dandelion in your lawn. So good examples that might be would qualify for this exception would be control of Japanese knotweed or Phragmites in terrestrial environments. Kinds of projects that would be meet this natural resources exception criteria are projects that would benefit a species of plant or animal native to Ontario. So if you're controlling vegetation to protect a species at risk or the habitat of a species at risk, this would also qualify for the natural resources exception. Or if your project was focused on protecting or restoring rare ecosystems or its components, like rehabilitating a tallgrass prairie ecosystem, that would also be eligible for the natural resources exception. So the criteria is, does the project meet integrated pest management principles? So probably most of you are aware of what IPM means, but essentially it's the practice of preventing or suppressing pest populations by applying multiple and coordinated tactics to control the species. So when you're applying for the letter of opinion, it's good to refer to the BMPs that you may be using to control the invasive plant. Usually we like to see things that have been BMPs that have been produced by the Invasive Plant Council as a reference document. But it can be BMPs from other jurisdictions as well. So this is requesting a letter of opinion from our on the natural resources exception. Our first, this is kind of a recap of everything I've just described. So number one is that no other exception for the use of a Class 9 pesticide applies. To contact your local M&R office for an application for a letter of opinion, and fill out the application form and submit it, and then M&R reviews the application to ensure that it meets the criteria for a natural resources management project and that its IP principles are being used. And then M&R may issue a written opinion stating that the project is a natural resource management project. If the written opinion is issued, project can proceed as described. So a key aspect of the written opinion is that it can be issued for up to 5 years. So when you're applying, you'll want to consider how long the project may be and ensure that if you think it's going to be a multi-year project, that you should include that within your application. It's important to ensure compliance of your project with all other provincial and federal regulations. And I just that applicants for letters of opinion should contact their local M&R office as early as possible to identify whether authorization is required under the Endangered Species Act, if an authorization associated with that is required. And that's it. I've provided my contact information below, as well as Scott. So if you have any questions about how to work through the letter of opinion process, I'm more than happy to answer your questions after this call and I guess.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much, Scott and Francine. So we do have a good chunk of time here for questions, and I see some coming through, so keep them coming through. So Scott, I'm just going to unmute you. So the question I have is, and let me just make sure I'm not missing, just type them into the Q&A box, not the chat box. But the first question is, does Parks Canada to manage, this is a federal question, does Parks Canada to manage federal property require exterminator and provincial permits to apply a pesticide?
Generally, it's into constitutional issues and stuff, so every individual situation needs to be assessed on its own merits, is what I would be told. But generally, yes, and a lot of the federal agencies also by policy adopt provincial requirements.
Okay, that's good. And as I mentioned, this is being recorded and posted, so we can, you guys are able to listen to the questions later. Something I've seen, generally speaking, how long does it take to have an application processed by you?
So the applications are processed by our district staff. So the time frame can vary depending on the quality of the application and that there isn't any questions and back and forth between the applicant and ministry staff. So it's best to provide, I would say, several months to allow that sort of back and forth and to apply sort of early, probably in the fall or winter, if you're planning to implement your project come the season in the spring and summer. So it's important to apply as early as you possibly can. Certainly, there can be opportunities where things can happen pretty quickly, especially if a district is familiar with your project already, but it's built time into your request.
Okay. Then it looks like it's a two-parter. Must a plant be listed under the Invasive Species Act or the Weeds Act to qualify as a plant to be controlled with a Class 9 pesticide?
Jen, I'd say no. So on the Weed Control Act lists those that are potentially noxious to an agricultural or horticultural operation, and being listed there might allow a plant to be controlled under the other legislative requirements. And I'll let you address the invasive species list.
No, the species does not need to be listed under the Invasive Species Act to be considered an invasive species eligible for control for this exception.
Okay. I guess
just to add that. So the Invasive Species Act lists a few terrestrial plants. So obviously there are many more.
Yeah. So the next question is, say that there was a species that potentially invasive, but maybe it's not quite considered invasive in Ontario. Is there some, like, a gauge that you might use designate a species as invasive?
So, just be on a case-by-case basis. You'd look at the species, and if there was none within the province that agreed that this was an invasive plant, then that would be sufficient. If it was a problem in other jurisdictions and it was a new species, then that would also indicate an invasive species. So it's just it's not really, it shouldn't really be that complicated.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Next one is the letter of opinion is required to use a class 9 at the use of class 10, which is, I think, glyphosate for mites on a dryland site.
All the ingredients listed in class 10 are also in class 9, so class 10 is a pesticide in class 9 that, it gets complicated. Actually, the class 10 only comes into play if it's a plant poisonous to the touch.
Okay.
Any of the other exceptions is 9 list, so glyphosate is also a class 9 active ingredient.
Okay. So in regards to the 1 hectare of forest, for the forestry exception, can the herbicide only be applied within that hectare? So this person's thinking about situations where the invasive main legal parcel of land, but where all the occurrence of it may not be inside that 1 hectare.
It would come down to essentially the intent and sort of like the reasonable intent. So if it's to control, say, dog strangling vine, there's some in the forest or some outside of the forest, it would be reasonable that to protect the forest, you would control a little bit that's outside, otherwise it's just going to spread back in. And all that would require the forestry license, which is sort of like, it's always been a forestry license for that type of extermination. If it was something that isn't going to grow in the forest and isn't going to bother the forest, so it's more protect the landscape or whatever else, then it would not be the forestry license, it would be the landscape license.
Okay. Hope that answered your question. So I think I'm just going ahead here. So is there any, I think this next question is referring to potentially like an invasive species exception. So is there anything on the horizon for that? So without needing to get a forestry license, so landscape license would be okay, to allow occasional users who are already using, who are already licensed in other ways to treat invasives?
Changes to legislation happen way above me, so I can't even comment on the changes or what may be coming. What I will say is that the licensing requirements are like predate the cosmetic ban. They were changed in 1998 or something. So for forestry extermination, the forestry license has always been required, and I can't see that changing. Then again, I have no idea as to what might be considered or coming.
Okay. The next one, I know when we get asked a lot, does the Weed Control Act apply to like an area alongside agriculture or just solely agriculture and horticulture practices?
The Weed Control Act is administered by the Ministry of Agriculture and Food, or MAPRA. I can't really answer that question. Essentially, it'll come down to if the local weed inspector says that plant, wherever it's found, needs to be controlled in order to protect agriculture or horticultural operation, then I'm not going to argue that. So it's because other legislation, I can't comment on the specifics, but it would be worth touching base with a local weed inspector.
Okay, so my next question is so if there's an invasive plant that's not specifically on a label, do I have any other options?
Some of the labels are worded to include, like, be more inclusive or exclusive, but whenever it comes to interpreting a label, I'm always going to refer people to Health Canada. So if you were to, say, Google the PMRA InfoServe, that gives you their contact information. You can also try contacting, if there's a specific plant or pet product, contacting the local specialist or regional specialist, a pesticide specialist. However, it's generally going to be up to Health Canada to interpret the meaning of the label, so whether a pest can be included or not. I've answered sort of both ways, depending on, depending on the specific scenarios. So it's to answer that.
Okay, yeah, like I guess you're just sometimes it says like other weedy species, so the best is just to contact the PMR and ask them if it goes. Yes,
and, it's best to contact them out of time as far as you can.
Okay. So if you found a patch of Phragmites in a stored gravel pit, say, so it would be a dry area, what exterminator license would apply? So get different licenses here.
Okay, yes. The public work is not a forest, so it's going to be a landscape class of license.
Landscape, okay. So keep the questions coming. Looks like being answered here. So you mentioned signage. So what's the around signage for like roads? So like the public works, I guess.
So for roadside extermination, the first part of the requirement for a non-residential area is that the sign has to be posted every 100 meters around the perimeter of the extermination. Whenever more than 20 signs are going to be required, there's the option to apply to the director, so in this case it would be the manager at Standards Development Branch, for an exception to the public notification, and that's, we're going to look at it and determine what is going to provide the appropriate amount of notice and but all be reasonable and practical if you're doing, several hundred kilometers of roadside. So usually that's going to be posting a few signs at the start of a long stretch or the end, or if there's a walking path that crosses, and newspaper ads in local newspapers. But that's all case by case. And if somebody's interested, if they were to send me an email, I will give them the appropriate email address and information for a letter or for alternative notification.
Okay. So if you've other than the natural resources of opinion exception, if you fall under agriculture, forestry, or public works or public health and safety, do you actually have to get would you suggest the step contacting your local regional pesticide specialist, and then after that point, do you have to have like a physical permit, or because you're under the exception, you're okay?
You're fall under one of the exceptions and meet all of the requirements, and there's different for each one. So for public works, the person has to have an opinion or a direction from an IPM certified person. The public work has to do an IPM annual report and so forth. Then there's no need to contact the specialist, so we don't get involved. If anyone's uncertain about it, especially for type or new scenario, then please feel free to give us a call and discuss it so that we can help guide you in the right direction.
Okay. I know there's a list of the MNRF district offices. Is there like a list of the regional pest specialists online, or?
There's a list of the regional offices online, and most of us have been in the same position for a while, but occasionally there's changes. So if you were to call the regional office, the general number, and for the pesticide specialist, you'd be connected. I'm trying to think where the easiest way. Well, make sure that Kelly, you have the list or the link, and I think Francine was talking about putting up the some information about the applying for the natural resources exception. But somewhere along there, we'll make sure that we put up a link to where the regional offices are.
Okay. The next one is, question, but perhaps you guys can interpret. Is there any restrictions for sites under 1 hectare for any license?
So assuming that would be a landscape type scenario, so it's not a public works, being under 1 hectare, then it's not a forest. So that'd be that would be the landscape. Is I don't know if that's just the question or not.
Not this person can add a little bit more information. But yeah, I'm not. You might for a forestry site. For sites under 1 hectare for forestry with any license.
Yeah, well, for the most part, if it's even if the treatment site is less than a hectare, but it's part of a forest, so it's for the benefit of the forest or for the establishment maintenance of the forest, then it is a forestry license. So even if it is less than 1 hectare, if the total area of trees is less than a hectare, it's not a forest; it would be a landscape.
Okay. Is there and this has been great, but are there any other additional, I can post them, I guess if there's other additional like online resources direct us to as well, we can post, if people just want to like, read something, if there's like guides or anything like that online. There
are a few at the, I'm trying to think the easiest way. I think it's just if you were to type in ontario.ca/pesticides, it would take you to kind of where the pesticide landing page. Sometimes it's easy to find stuff, sometimes not. I think what we should do is have a look at, see which ones are relevant to on or cross-link to the OIPC website.
Okay. Yeah. So I think this is a combination here. So it looks like they're trying to determine if it's a forest or a letter of opinion. So if there was a dry natural habitat next to a forest, was infested with Phragmites, and the Phragmites was potentially deterring something like forest exception, which exception would apply? Would this more or less require a letter of opinion? Because
always so many little intricacies and for each state, I don't give a concrete answer, so I'll recommend that they contact the regional pesticide specialist just to flesh it out a bit more. Because the forestry definition does include for the establishment of a forest, if my first thought would be that if it is to allow for succession and stuff, it'd be considered under the forestry. Okay. But again, we'll recommend that you do contact the local specialist just to confirm and get all those out. Okay. So next one in relation to the other one, the second last question. So they were asking if under 1 hectare, or maybe it was dry site, would be landscape, but landscape license. But could under 1 hectare can be considered a natural resource exception? Yeah, acting a natural resource, or as you outlined in the presentation. So under 1 hectare could, depending on the site, you could apply for a letter of opinion. Correct. Okay. Okay. Okay, so if you have any other questions here, I know there's one question here that I'll leave at the end just because it's another topic. But if anyone has any other questions, here's your last chance. Does Scott or Francine want to add any additional comments? I'll just add one, which is just regarding water exterminations and the requirement for the permit. Just to note that the cosmetic ban applies to land exterminations, so any water exterminations would not be subject to the ban, and partly that's because it does require the permit, so there's going to be that extra level of scrutiny. And then also, I got a question, I guess just to me, so I'll answer that as well, and that's an estimated timeline for water-tolerant Phragmites herbicide might be available. And I have no idea on that one, but Francine, you may have more information.
Looks like a question sent to him there.
Yeah, so it's just about when the a herbicide for Phragmites and water would be available. I think talking to some of the companies.
Yeah, so as far as I'm aware, so there is one company that has submitted an application for registration to the federal government. That is BSF for their product Habitat Aqua, and it's my understanding that that application is being reviewed by Health Canada's Pest Management Regulatory Agency with respect to the timing and their decision. That's the responsibility of the federal government.
Great. I'll just finish with this one. It was a bit, I left it to the end, sorry about that. But so it was, you know, which invasive plants or species are a growing concern for the next few years, primarily southwestern Ontario. So I guess, you know, what comes to my mind for people to look up is the new Invasive Species Act and some of the prohibited on that list of ones that are of concern. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Francine, or any things on. I kind of have ones in my mind that I'm concerned about, but over the next years, I would say the ones we already have are an issue. So just asking, like, which invasive plants or species are a growing concern over the next few years?
It would be different depending on
for sure.
That's a bit of a challenging one in a period of time. Certainly, there are different ways to answer the question depending on your perspective.
Definitely.
You might answer it, well, what are the ones that are really threatening Ontario that have not got here yet? Like mile minute weed in New York State, or hydra also in New York. Or then you have, you know, species that are here in Ontario that are well established, but are certainly a serious concern, and resource agencies are trying to deal with them on the landscape. So it's that's a difficult one to
That was a good answer.
But the Invasive Species Act does outline a process for assessing what species will be listed. The document that I can share a link with you that just outlines sort of here's the process for assessing what species are next on the list. Okay.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Scott, very much for attending, and Francine as well. Couldn't do these without you. So thanks, everyone. And if you have any other additional questions or comments, there is the contact information for Francine and Scott, and we will be posting this presentation and the recording online. Okay, Scott.
Thank you.